In this video, we are going to explore a new study that came out on Huntington's disease. And the authors were trying to understand the initial triggering events for one of the early symptoms in Huntington's, which is loss of motor control. And the goal for them is maybe with this new knowledge and understanding of what leads to the symptoms of Huntington's, we can use targeted therapeutics and maybe reduce or delay the symptoms, maybe even prevent the symptoms, which would be a wonderful thing. As you know, there is no cure, and the treatment for Huntington's is just managing those symptoms. So maybe this is a groundbreaking result, and we are going to dive into the details of them now. So Huntington's is a neurological disorder that is age dependent and begins around 30 years of age. It can progress from between your 30 and till you're 50 years old. And I always find it interesting that age dependent diseases, there's got to be some sort of counter going on in your cells that is keeping track of the deterioration of, in this case, neurons and coordination for some sort of disease to consistently take place at a specific age. I always found that to be interesting and thought-provoking. Anyways, so there are 3 stages in Huntington's. You have the early stage, the middle stage, late stages. Early stages, you begin to feel minor cognitive impairment. You are unable to concentrate. You have maybe a little bit of memory loss. You also have motor impairment. You are involuntarily going to have herky-jerky movements. They might be kind of weak or passive early on, but once you reach middle stages and late stages, they become much more overt and debilitating. The third symptom in early stage is psychiatric. You have issues with depression, mood, anxiety. These things are troublesome early on, especially when you're confronted with the news that perhaps you have Huntington's, which we know the outcome of, and it's not very pretty. Middle stages, all of those things just worsen. And then late stages, depression actually improves, but you develop dementia. And the reason depression maybe improves is because of dementia, where you are less aware of your surroundings and less aware of what's going on. But yeah, ultimately it's a horrible neurological disorder, and so it is awesome that people are studying how we can improve perhaps our medicine with respect to Huntington's. Now, the main claim of the study is that loss of ISPN coordination upregulates the GST02 metabolic pathway, and this leads to hyperdopaminergia, or high elevated dopamine levels, which causes hyperkinesia, that herky-jerky movement I already mentioned. Excuse me. And so there are a couple of terms that you probably have no idea what they are, and so I want to break them down a little bit for us. So we have ISPN, which is a subset of neurons in the striatum, which is a portion of the basal ganglia, and these release inhibitory neurotransmitters, which is, we will learn, is important for regulating, I would say, the GST02 pathway. And the GST02 pathway is just a metabolic pathway that involves a glutathione enzyme that is implicated in many neurological disorders, but is involved in catalyzing various different redox reactions and energy metabolism. Hold on one second. Excuse me, sorry. Coming off of a cold, I think. Good, so we've defined those 2 terms, and then there's one other term that's important for us to understand. That's TRKB BDNF, and this is a protein receptor in the ISPNs that the scientists are focused on experimentally controlling for and experimentally looking at and analyzing for its role in regulating GST02. And of course, this is a protein receptor for brain development, and it binds to BDNF, which is a neurotrophic factor. Okay, so why don't we look at the evidence? And they use mouse models, and they have actually a lot of evidence in the study, so I recommend looking at it. And it has mouse models that I primarily am focused on for the evidence in this video. And what they were able to do is they took TRKB knockout mice, and they showed that it upregulated GST02, which is the main claim of the study. This increased dopamine levels. Those dopamine levels created motor dysfunction in the mice, and this motor dysfunction was age dependent. So exactly what we see in Huntington's and the early stages and throughout. 1 second again. In addition, they gathered evidence showing that if they were able to reduce GST02 activity, dopamine levels dropped, motor dysfunction was less frequent, less present for the mice. And all of this is consistent with cocaine research, which is a dopamine reuptake inhibitor. So it prevents dopamine from being reabsorbed. So it sits in the synaptic cleft of neurons longer so that it may bind to receptors more frequently and engage in activity, which leads to motor dysfunction once again. So as we can see, there's plenty of evidence that the loss of coordination in ISPNs within the striatum, specifically TRKB receptors, are playing a vital role in dopamine regulation, and specifically the metabolic pathway of GST02. If we can really find ways to therapeutically intervene in that pathway and control dopamine levels to an equilibrium that is comfortable for our biological systems, we can maybe treat and help people with Huntington disease, as well as many other neurological disorders. And that is the outcome of this study. And so we'll see you in the next video.